Season 1 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley, Daniel Murphy, and Douglas Dollars, who reminds you to be present, be loving, and that life moves really fast. As a man who's recorded so many field interviews all over Los Angeles, why is this a good location, do you think, we're sitting in right now?
It's pretty.
Sure. That comes across, too, I think.
This is the park outside of the library. It's sculpted, has a lot of grass, it has fountains, it has a lot of shade. It feels like you're in a city. It's just a nice place. So then I figured it was central enough, a good place for us to meet. It's in the heart of Los Angeles.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, talking with a favorite guest from the old show, The Marketplace of Ideas, John Rabe, beloved Los Angeles public radio personality. He hosts Off Ramp on the weekends, which we described in our last conversation as a pointillist portrait of the city. And I want to know where else, in Los Angeles and the whole thing, where else stands out as just really good places to record in your mind, since you've done so many field pieces?
Yesterday, I went to Malibu and interviewed Cheech Marin at his beach house in Malibu. That was pretty nice.
Is it like, what did you picture?
I don't care about the listeners in that case. Yeah. In that case, it was just wonderful to be on his porch, looking at the ocean, hearing the ocean.
I imagine it's pretty swank over at Cheech's place.
Yeah, very nice. It's not so much fancy as it's very, very, very comfortable.
Malibu, to the non-Malibu savvy listener, we should say that this is a place that you probably have had to go a few times to talk to a celebrity of a Cheech standing, right? I mean, a lot of them live there.
I think he's the first that I've interviewed in Malibu. No,
really?
That's not true. No, we interviewed Lou Adler, but that was kind of on his bluff side, in his bluff side home, not beach side. He has two houses, one down on the beach, one way up on a bluff. It's 26 miles long, 26 miles of coastline. It must be the skinniest city in the world. Parking's very difficult. And I really can't see living there unless you just stayed on the beach. I don't understand the people who live on the bluffs and the mountains around Malibu. It just doesn't make sense to me because it's so far from anywhere else. Because the ocean is the draw.
Right. And it's a big town for celebrities to overturn their Dodge Vipers and stuff in, right? That's always happening, it seems like. At least from afar, when I was reading Los Angeles news, it was always like when a celebrity took a dive and survived, usually they were drunk in Malibu. Is that right?
Yes, it's always true.
Oh, okay.
Every celebrity.
I figured.
It's a rite of passage.
Just checking. Now, you only have been to Malibu to record a couple times, but where does Off Ramp take you? Where are the places you'd find yourself recording in a lot in this city?
I have to confess, I probably have spent too much time downtown because I live near downtown, because our bureau used to be downtown. I'm in Pasadena now most of the time, and downtown's a very easy shot down the 110. So I probably could spend more time in, say, Fullerton or Riverside or some of the more far-flung places. Downtown's easy, so I probably spend too much time here. We did a pretty nice trip down Whittier Boulevard into East LA a couple of years ago with Charles Phoenix, just sampling some of the flavor on that trip. And I really like that idea of just following a road and seeing where it goes, because inevitably it becomes this cross-section of Los Angeles. Whittier Boulevard's case, it starts just outside of downtown and then heads east and brings you through at least two historic cemeteries, the place where they allowed Jews to be buried in the early years, plus a huge Catholic cemetery. So, the Warners and the Lemleys and all of their ilk are buried in East Los Angeles, which you might not expect because of their wealth, but it was segregated back then. There were all the laws. Then you move further into East LA and you get great funky architecture and old theaters and all kinds of things. Sunset Boulevard is another one of those. It starts at Cesar Chavez downtown, and you head west. You can go all the way to the ocean, and it brings you through some of the most rundown and some of the swankest parts of Los Angeles.
That seems like an uncommonly fruitful pursuit, to just take a road and run with it here. Like, I don't know, I live near Normandy Avenue. I find I could go down that and get some fascinating sights and foods especially, right?
Have you done it?
I should. I don't have a car, but I could bus it or I could just walk.
I don't know Normandy.
Oh, okay, it's long. I don't know. There's some long streets here with, more importantly, with stuff you don't necessarily expect. I mean, you've been here a while, although a lot longer than I have.
12 years now.
12 years, yes. About 12 years longer than me. I mean, it's not too hard to still get surprised by stuff here, is it?
No, it's huge. There are so many cultures. There's so many, intersecting lives here that I have not lacked for stories. I'm doing Off-Ramp now for about 5 years and reporting here for 12 years, hosting for all the years. There's 14 million people. Stuff is happening. Stuff is constantly changing here. And it's also easy to stay focused just on the things you enjoy. There are lots of crime stories, lots of corruption stories. But if you just did stories about interesting art, the fluffier, the lighter stories, you still would never run out of stories.
And this brings to mind, I mean, I think of streets you can follow. I think of locations you can record. And, I think of organizing principles for the way people approach this city. You can use those. People use restaurants. People use what parts of the world can I kind of visit by seeing them in microcosm where in the city. What if I ask you about the frameworks you've used to organize the city in your head? What would you say? Have there been ones you can recognize and remember?
I'm much more random than that.
That's a framework. How do you use that randomness?
If I don't know that I use it. It just kind of happens. It just happens. We have on some shows we'll have a story about politics and stories about art, and sometimes we'll be in Whittier and in the same show as we're in Santa Monica. We try to keep it random, but we don't try. It just happens.
Yeah, that's become sort of a philosophical question, or maybe mathematical. Trying for randomness. You sort of bite your own tail at a certain point, right?
Try to improvise something.
Don't work according to a pattern. Now, I wanted to ask you to sort of get a baseline here. That's probably the wrong word, but on the Off-Ramp blog, you will mention the neighborhood you live in, Cypress Park. Tell me about that neighborhood.
Cypress Park is a small, mostly Latino neighborhood now in the foothills of Mount Washington. It's kind of near Highland Park. It's in, I'd call it the northwest crotch of the of the 110 and the 5. If you don't know where all the neighborhoods are, it used to be primarily Italian. This is back, I think, in the 20s and 30s and 40s. This is the area a lot of Italians lived in because it was close to Little Italy, which is where Chinatown is now. There are only one or two remnants of Little Italy. There's Little Joe's Italian restaurant. There's an Italian Catholic church on North Broadway. And there's also the San Antonio Winery. And that's about it as far as the Italian heritage goes. Many Italians also lived in this neighborhood because they worked in the trolley yards. The MTA now has a huge maintenance facility there, but that used to be 4 trolleys. So they lived in that neighborhood. Then I think sometime 40s, 50s, 60s, Latinos started moving in. The Italians started moving out. I imagine that part of that was, Italian flight or whatever. They weren't keen on Latinos moving into their neighborhood. Although,
where did they go?
Don't know. Well, they probably dispersed. The same way, any other group does. They come to the country, they build a life, then the second generation moves out, and they get better jobs. They move out. So it became primarily Latino. This is the neighborhood that City Councilman Ed Reyes and many others grew up in. It was pretty lousy through the 90s into the early 2000s. There are very, very bad gang problems. This is the neighborhood where the famous Isabel Drive shooting happened in, I think, in 1997. The one that was broadcast all across the United States and the world, where a couple with their kids supposedly were driving home from Dodger Stadium after a game, and they were looking for a shortcut. Well, that's BS. Pat Morrison, who's now with KPCC, reported for the LA Times a few months later that, in fact, they discovered it was a drug deal gone wrong. The key incident in that And that crime happened when the supposed thugs in the neighborhood shot into the car and a baby was killed. But it wasn't that. It was a drug deal gone wrong. So
and somehow became that in the
first
media.
part of that story was broadcast across the world. The update was never broadcast. So that's one notorious thing that happened in Cypress Park. More recently, we had the shooting of Sheriff's Deputy Escalante, an execution-style murder, like 4:30 in the morning a few years ago. Somebody showed up with an AK-47, I think, outside of one of the elementary schools to gun down a guy. So we've had our share of bad stuff that's happened. This is the area of one of the most historic, nastiest gangs in town, the Avenues.
It seems like this stuff combined could
There's more.
There's more. Oh, okay.
There's more. You know about the Great White Hope?
On.
Have you heard about it?
No.
It's a movie that was made with James Earl Jones, and the Great White Hope was a prize fighter named James Jeffries. James Jeffries built a huge house that looks like Terra in Cypress Park back, I think, around 1920, maybe a little bit earlier. It stands out among all the other little two-bedroom Spanish bungalows.
This
place
of those.
is huge, and you can't miss it. It's right on Isabel, just a few blocks from my house. James Jeffries was the Great White Hope who was supposed to defeat Jack Johnson, who was the prize fighter who was basically hounded out of the U.S. because I believe he had a white girlfriend or a white wife. He was also denied passage on the Titanic because, I believe, of his race.
Well, that worked out for him in the end, but still, it's the principle of the thing, you know?
So Jeffries lives in this house till 1927, and then the C. Leong family bought it. They were one of the first families to move out of Chinatown. I think they were the founders of East West Bank. Lisa C., the famous local author. This is her family. She didn't live in this house, but they lived in this house from 1927 until 1997. So it's historic in that way, too. It played an important role in the Chinese-American community here. So that's all I know about Cypress Park.
Right, but that's a lot, and it's a neighborhood that I would say, I talk to people on the west side, say, about the neighborhoods they know about, and they might have only heard the name Cypress Park and not known the history.
Or they think it's Cypress in Orange County.
Exactly. It's one big mass that just sort of is in the corner of their mental map. But it's fascinating to me that you can be not that geographically far ultimately from a neighborhood, but still have a vast amount of information to overturn if you just take a little while to look. I mean, maybe that's stereotypical of the way of the West Side East Side divide. I don't know, but you get that impression?
I think it has more to do with the fact that there are many that history is not necessarily as much a tradition of Los Angeles residents as it is in New York or Chicago or Philadelphia. I think that more. Well, it might also be that neighborhoods are in Philly, in New York, that they are they don't change as much. I could be totally wrong. It's just a theory of mine. So if you're in one neighborhood for a long time, you really know the history because it's, your family was there for a long time. The same kinds of things have been happening. This is a shot in the dark.
Sure.
Los Angeles, neighborhoods change a lot more. Also, my guess is the population's a bit more transient here. So you move in, you're here for 10 years or 20 years, then you move out. Those, I think, all factor into just plus Los Angeles churns. Los Angeles changes. Things happen here, and we spread the word to the rest of the world, and then we move on to the next thing. Making important contributions to society along the way, but not talking about them because we're busy going off and doing the next best thing. Los Angeles is about the future more than it is about its past. So maybe that's a reason that people simply don't know what happened in their neighborhood as well as others. Although, tons of people know the history of Los Angeles very well. There are many books. There's many people have written about it. The resources are absolutely there. Many of the resources are here at the Central Library.
It is funny because it's what you hear from people. They say, "Oh, Los Angeles, there's not a sense of history there." But then, I've spent a lot of time already down in the bottom floor of this library, plowing through Los Angeles-related books, whether it's history, architecture, geography. There's this abundance of people who are willing to talk about the history and resources, at the same time a prevailing attitude that, well, history doesn't matter so much. It's a strange divide.
I don't know that that is an attitude, though, a prevailing attitude. There's no proof that it's a prevailing attitude, but it's a reputation that LA has.
Sure.
And the rest of the
prevailing
country
reputation.
Yeah, and people are always glad to assign traits to Los Angeles. Including Angelinos that they haven't really vetted. Since we're talking about the library, if you go to lapl.org and then click on the photo archive, you can browse for free through the hundreds of thousands of photos that are in this archive that will tell you all about Los Angeles. It's a remarkable archive. You can type in a random word. You can type in pigeon or jaguar or park bench and come up with a whole cross-section of photos that go way back to 1900 all the way up till today that will tell you about Los Angeles in ways that you haven't imagined. And, of course, put a face to all the regular people of Los Angeles. It's a very well curated photo archive. It's totally available to the public. I heartily encourage people. It's at lapl.org.
And you've posted about it in the Off-Ramp blog, like typing in thanks and getting this range of images with all stories behind them. Tell me about the hours you've spent browsing this archive.
We need for the web on Off-Ramp, we need images. Right. And I figure instead of going and getting a stock image of whatever, a park bench or something, I don't know.
Sure.
Or getting an image from the AP or from Getty Images that everybody's already seen, maybe it's better to illustrate a story with a historic image that tells us something different, that tells us something that other people don't know about the history of Los Angeles. So if I can find something that even is vaguely related to what we're talking about on the show, or maybe not at all, maybe just random, I find that of much greater value. It promotes the public library. It promotes history. It promotes people that you may not ever have heard of who wind up in these captions in these photos. So probably every week we use half a dozen at least photos from the LA Public Library archive. It's an easy resource to use, and I think it's very rewarding. I assume the library likes the exposure.
No doubt. Now, it's like you type in Cypress Park, I type in Koreatown, and we see our neighborhoods through the ages, the decades, centuries.
Yep. Yeah.
Excellent.
It's very, very easy to use. And type your own name, see what happens.
Who knows? My historical predecessors in Los Angeles could well pop up.
If you ever think that we are especially salacious now, how did Don Cornelius commit suicide, or tell me more about this or that celebrity? If you go back in the LA Public Library photo archive, you will see in-depth coverage of celebrity trials. It's stuff that we have forgotten about now. People were just as interested. These things got just as much coverage in the 1930s and 40s as they ever did, and all of this coverage includes arrows pointing to the accused on trial. They did a lot more of that, I think, back in those days, which I like. Superimposing arrows or circling people in the photographs to make sure that the viewers got the idea.
Right. Well, why do we think we're worse about that now?
People are egotistical, or they don't know their history.
They're egotistical in that, man, we have to be worse. We've got to be the worst.
It's like baseball. There were so many bad baseball players in the 1920s and 30s, but you don't hear about them. Of course not. You'd hear about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and people say, well, Willie Mays, those were the days. There were awful ball players. They were, the majority of ball players never hit 300, right? People forget. They glamorize the past. It's more fun to think about the glamorous past than the mundane past.
You want to be convinced things are going to the dogs now.
Oh, I suppose. Everybody wants to think that they're witnessing the decline of civilization.
It's funny because here in Los Angeles, reading some of the attitudes about the city over the decades, it seems like now is much less of a this city is turning into hell time than it's maybe ever been. Other than the real boosterous times of the early 20th century, it seems people seem more optimistic about Los Angeles than they were 20, 30 years ago.
Because crime has dropped so precipitously. We haven't had a riot in 20 years now. Crime is at historic lows. So it's a safer city. There's I don't know that there's any less poverty. I haven't checked those figures. I imagine poverty is much higher. But yeah, generally it's safer. I think people feel better about it. Downtown has actually started to revive. So that's good news. People were very pessimistic about that in around 2000. I think people love the idea in general of the LA River being revitalized, and we see that happening all over the place. I think there's pretty good reason to think that Los Angeles is becoming livable. Maybe it's just getting used to its size now. I don't know.
To what degree have you been able to feel a change in the place over the 12 years you've had your finger on the pulse? Is that too short a frame of time to do that, or is it? Can you say this?
Yeah,
this
I'd hesitate to say, because I simply haven't been here long enough. I know that crime has gone down since I've been here.
Right.
There have been gang crackdowns and like that. I have seen downtown come back. I have seen the number of homeless on the street decrease and the number of supportive housing units go up. Still not at levels it needs to be at, but those things have actually happened. And you can see that downtown is a more pleasant place to be. I haven't been in all of the I can't document that for all the other cities around here.
We talked on our last conversation about how you geographically placed yourself here when you moved from the upper Midwest, how you were able to look down from the Griffith Observatory and see what was where and all that. But coming down here to work at KPCC, how did you get your mind grounded in Southern California so you could hit the ground running? I mean, just in terms of intellectually preparing yourself for the place, what could you do?
I didn't, actually.
Didn't? Well, that's improvisation.
There wasn't time. I came here on about 5 days' notice. And nor do I think I would have done more than, just read a few books or something. Getting high in Los Angeles is the best way to understand Los Angeles.
Seeing the thing, looking down?
Yep, going up to the top of City Hall, going up to Griffith Observatory, going to the Getty, going to the huge, beautiful park just south of downtown. I forget the exact name of it right now, where you can see all of the streets laid out in front of you. So you see how far down Western goes, and you can see Sunset Boulevard and how far it goes, Wilshire, all the rest of these. You can kind of figure out, okay, that's where Riverside is. That's where, Catalina is. You can see it. At least for me, I need to see these things graphically myself to kind of understand the geography. Then once you get the geography, you can understand how the city works,
right,
what all these places are that people are talking about. If you don't know where Whittier is, and somebody's talking about Whittier and things that are happening there, the first thing, you stop listening at Whittier, or you get confused at the name Whittier. But if you know where that is, then you can take it the next step. And when somebody says, well, in Whittier, they're trying to revamp the Golden Gate Theater, you can then proceed to the next idea in that sentence. And with radio, a lot, and I analyze this stuff very closely with radio because I work in radio, because radio is about teaching people things. You have to, people are ironing, they're working, they're talking with their friends, they're driving, they're doing a million other things. They're not just sitting listening to our radio, our podcasts, with headphones on, taking notes.
In a sensory deprivation chamber.
They're not, no. And I don't know that I'd want listeners like that, but they're not. They're not paying nearly as close attention as we think they are. So when you do a story, you have to say, you have to bite it, you have to break it off into bite-sized pieces and give it to people so that they can understand it. So you have to say, identify where Whittier is, then take it the next step, and then take it the next step after that. And too many radio writers, I think that the audience is I don't know, it's ego, isn't it? Or sloppiness. You got to walk them through it.
It's the idea of teaching them sort of based on the idea of not losing them. Get that down, and then you can teach.
Well, how many ads do you hear where they'll say, go to johnrabe.com. That's johnrabe.com. johnrabe.com or 1-800-367-5723.
Right.
All of a sudden, people forget what the website was.
True.
And they spend all this time in the ad teaching you the website, and then they give a phone number at the end that nobody's going to call, because now they've forgotten both the website and the phone number. It's just classic bad ad writing. Listen to the radio. Now you'll hear that a million times.
I won't be able to stop hearing it.
Right. Exactly. That's radio theory in a nutshell.
Getting the geography of Los Angeles down before you can get other things about the city down. I can see why that's important. You've explained that. Is it the same in other cities you've been to where you need to see where things are and only then can you know? Or is it the size of Los Angeles that makes that more important here? Or is it the way the neighborhoods work? Or is it just wherever you are? You got to get up and look down.
I didn't like living in Minnesota so much, so I don't think I learned Minnesota as well.
The less you knew, the better.
I just wasn't quite as interested in it. And it was always very confusing that Uptown was actually south of downtown Minneapolis. So that was a problem. I think that it was... See, I can't even remember now exactly the geography. Maybe it was further north. Philadelphia was fascinating, and I learned a lot about Philadelphia.
The same deal? You had to learn the geography first?
Yeah, but
physical...
it's much clearer because there's Broad
Sure.
Street and there's Market Street, and I also was only there two years, so I kept learning, and it Philadelphia was laid out much more logically too. One of the things that struck me about Philadelphia was how there'd be a wonderful neighborhood next to an awful neighborhood, an absolutely slum-like awful neighborhood. I have no idea why that happens, but one block would be pristine and beautiful with lovely row houses and street lamps and everything. And then 2 blocks over, you might see, burning mattresses.
2 blocks over. Now, that's a fascinating element about Philadelphia that you don't see in Los Angeles. What else was fascinating about that city that is different than Los Angeles?
Well, we don't have a mob here.
No mob, yeah. We've got to get a mob.
I miss reporting on the mob. I don't understand gangs quite as much.
Is that like one of those classically interesting reporters' beats? They just, please give me the mob. I want to do the mob.
Absolutely. Well, it's just fascinating, and they're a little bit. I know that the mob has its fingers in drugs and a lot of bad stuff, but for the most part, the mob is, or at least was, reasonably well organized, and you wouldn't get. You could live in a mob neighborhood without being in danger of being shot.
Oh, I see.
They were better at targeting. They didn't do random shootings and like that. Although they kind of lost discipline around the time I arrived in Philadelphia. So there's that. So it's a thing you can kind of look at more in isolation if you want to.
Is the mob now dissolute? Like they're now getting to the drive-by point? You mentioned they were losing their discipline.
when I was in Philadelphia. Apparently, I think this is how it worked. Apparently, Skinny Joey Merlino tried to hit John Stanfa as John Stanfa was driving on the highway, with thousands and thousands of other people. They didn't used to do that kind of stuff. They would wait till he got to his house and then kill him. So, yeah, that showed that the Young Turks were trying to take over, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. The honor is gone.
Yeah.
Crime doesn't seem as interesting in Los Angeles. Is that true?
No.
No, it seems just sort of...
Have you checked into the McMartin preschool case lately?
No, I have not.
This?
I've actually heard the phrase, but if you could give some background for the listener.
I don't remember all of the details, but it's absolutely worth checking out on Wikipedia.
Sure.
Something weird apparently was happening at this preschool. And I forget even the dates of this, early 90s. It became the biggest criminal trial in the history of the world and took forever. And
that's a biggest criminal trial in the history of the world. Let's meditate on that.
All kinds of defendants. And what happened was the people who ran the school were charged with abusing the kids there. But then investigators quite clearly influenced the kids to come up with these outrageous accusations. And when I say outrageous, not that he sexually abused me 50 times or something like that. No, that the space aliens were involved, that there were secret tunnels, that there were torture chambers, all these things. And what happened was the investigators obviously just planted all of these ideas in these kids' heads and wouldn't take no for an answer at first when the kids said, well, no, nothing happened to me. No,
right.
you sure? Well, you sure it wasn't something? What might have happened? They used all these bogus investigation techniques. It ballooned. It became this awful mess. There are many people who think that absolutely something did happen with these kids, but it just became this enormous fiasco. It's in Wikipedia. It's a good half-hour read. You'll just be astounded at how stupid people were to believe that this could actually have happened. They've gone back. There are people who still will say, well, if you go back to the site, they've obviously concreted up the tunnels that used to be there. No, it just never happened.
Space aliens. When you're reporting on a story, do you want stupidity to be a part of it? At least a little bit of stupidity to be involved?
No, I don't think so. I guess not. I don't. Well, it depends. It depends on the kind of
stupidity.
The kind of the story. Like, I don't know if you're following what's happening in San Fernando, in the valley. The mayor was having an affair with one of the city council members, and he admitted to it publicly in front of his wife at a city council meeting, without any sort of self-realization that this is a huge violation of the Brown Act. And they were meeting. Did they not speak the entire time they were meeting? That's kind of hard to believe. And so that's kind of stupid. You'd have to say it's just kind of stupid. Why is this happening? So that's kind of a fun story to cover, but I let the stories happen themselves. I don't will there to be stupidity.
Right.
Stupidity will naturally arise on its own.
We don't need to create stupidity. It's not a job that needs filling. Now, was Cypress Park your entry point into Los Angeles, or had you lived
moved
other
to
places?
South Pasadena first.
Okay. So
I just drove around, found a beautiful little neighborhood near the station. That was in South Pasadena. It was one of those, I think it was Melrose Place apartments, where there are 10 apartments on the top and 10 on the bottom, and a palm tree and a pool, and rent was something like $650 for a one-bedroom.
Get out.
I did eventually, but yeah, $650.
Did you feel the need to get out because the $650 was buying what I would expect $650 to buy today, or?
No, it was small, and I wanted to buy a house, so I bought a house.
Sure. Now, tell me what neighborhoods have fascinated you over this time? Not necessarily, I want to live there, but just what neighborhoods sort of keep piquing your interest over the decade and 2 years you've been here?
I'd like to live in Mount Washington just because it's central to everything, and yet filled with trees and quiet and doesn't have helicopters.
That's an area fairly near Cypress Park.
Yeah,
correct?
It's just up the hill from us. I don't know that other neighborhoods fascinate me in that way. No, I don't have a.
Your interest in the city is not neighborhood dictated. It's not like I got to check out what's happening over there on Fairfax.
I like the names of things. I'd like to live someplace that's called Gardens, but I don't know that I'd actually want to live in Hawaiian Gardens or Bell Gardens.
No,
although Bell Gardens actually has a lot of nice housing stock.
Really?
But I like the name Gardens. I'd like it to be in a place that I live. I might change the name of my
There's
house.
a nice mid-century flair to that, isn't there?
Yeah,
Gardens in there. But I mean, aside from where you live, like just keeping your eye on the city, there's certain places that draw your eye or ear back, aren't there? You said you're often reporting in downtown.
I have a very short attention span.
Sure. But that means you have to move around. You have to what patterns you're going in. I know you don't go by patterns. You're random and you're peripatetic. But I'm certain.
I think this sounds like you are fascinated with a neighborhood.
I'm fascinated with all kinds of things. All kinds of things. As are you. I mean, maybe I go around a little less randomly, but I want to get some insight into, I mean, not necessarily sort of how are you systematically approaching it if you're not systematically approaching it, but just where you wind up a lot, what you wind up, what frequencies, metaphorically, you wind up tuning into here in Los Angeles.
I don't know that I can answer that.
This is
I'm looking ahead. I'm not ruminating.
This is an episode of Stump the Rabe, I can tell. But even if you're looking ahead and thinking about how and where and why you should look ahead.
No. I'm remarkably not. I just don't do that.
That's fascinating to me. But it seems to have served you well. It served you well in putting together Off Ramp. I mean, that's got to give the show its character. That way of.
Sure. Well, because it becomes a true sampling of I don't know, whatever's interesting me this week. Can we talk about driving just for a second?
I would like to talk about
driving. Can I give people
driving.
one helpful, useful hint when they're on the highway?
Sure.
When you want to slow down, take your foot off the gas.
Oh, yes, and I've heard you, I don't know if I've read you write about this or heard you mention it on the show, but yeah, you even had
this crazy old trick.
You had a show, you had a show where what was I forget what the commute was, but you did it one way, did it the other, you did it one way.
Oh, that wasn't me just being mad at people. This was
sure.
I got in the car with Ralph Vardabadian and we drove from downtown, who's a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. We drove north from downtown up to Pasadena on the beautiful parkway. It's now called the Arroyo Parkway, We drove north at about 55 or 60 miles an hour, which is what most people drive at now. But the parkway was actually built as a parkway with beautiful curves and beautiful scenery, and it's best appreciated at 40 or 45 miles an hour tops. And you can stay in the right lane and just drive 45 miles an hour up to Pasadena. You'll make it about 2 minutes later. You won't be all stressed out. You won't have to freak out about people who are trying to pull onto the highway from these insanely tight entrance ramps. I think they're called double-folded diamonds or something like that.
That I didn't know.
Yeah, and it's a much more peaceful drive. No, my thing about the...
yeah, but don't brake.
You develop all kinds of theories in Los Angeles about people and how they drive.
Right.
And one of the key things is people don't understand that on highways, you're not supposed to use your brakes unless it's an emergency or you're actually slowing down in order to get off the highway.
That's straight off the manual? The manual of driving?
It's just common sense.
Common sense, sure.
We're all driving 55 miles an hour. You put on your brakes, that means a dog is running across the street or somebody's had a blowout.
Right.
It doesn't mean, I don't know how to take my foot off the accelerator. I don't know how big my car is and how fast it's going. People use the brakes instead of learning how to judge the momentum of their car, whether it's a Miata or whether it's a huge, Suburban. They just don't pay attention to that. Instead, they use the brakes, and then they tell me, slow down. I think you don't drive, but when you do, you'll notice all these chain reaction stops. I think we lose, billions of dollars every day on the roads. I'm probably exaggerating. In people's time and brake pads, because they have to slow down when people don't actually want to slow down. They just don't know how to drive their car.
Time is money, brake pads are money, and I'm glad. See, this is the quality of your wandering mind I wanted to tap into, because I wouldn't have naturally gone toward freeways as a subject or driving, but how could I miss that? Talking about Los Angeles. I'm 27.
Right, you're not angry yet. You're not 45.
When do I turn angry? What was the year you became angry?
43. As soon as you turn 43, it's documented. That's when you start to become the old man with the beard on the front porch who yells at the kids for crossing his lawn.
And is freeway driving really the engine of anger that it's supposed to be here?
It's awful frustrating. Again, yesterday I drove, and this is on my mind because I drove yesterday from Malibu. If people would adopt my simple rules, we'd all be much happier. Most people do follow these rules, but then there are the people who think that they're above the rules, who should be banished. This is my other theme now.
Where do we send them?
Outside of the city limits, or maybe outside of the state. Doesn't matter. Maybe there's an island someplace, or maybe we just kick them out of the state and let them go where they will. But
make a sort of structure on Terminal Island and...
No. It's not incarceration. This is just ostracization. Sure. We're just ostracizing them in the good old-fashioned village way.
Okay.
So this would include... I draw a distinction between people who do things that we can understand. Mm-hmm. You cheat on your taxes. I can understand that. That's okay. I don't find that as antisocial as littering. You're littering. You don't care about the social contract.
That's true.
Get out of town. We don't want you here. We don't want child abusers. But let's say you murder your partner who was nagging you for 25 years. It was a crime of passion. I can understand that. We'll jail you.
Sure.
But when you're done with your term, I think you can come back and live. If it was a crime of passion, you weren't just wantonly disregarding everybody else in the world.
Right.
People who throw trash out of their cars, people who drive like idiots, people who run stoplights.
You could see a lot of it.
If you speed through a neighborhood, you could kill a kid.
True.
You just don't care. You think you're better than everybody else. Well, okay, go off, start your own village. Get out of here.
Right. Start your bad driving village. Run all the stops you want. Endanger your village, just not the village of Los Angeles.
Exactly.
Now,
you want to be vice chair of this committee? Because there has to be a banishment committee.
I think so. I think I could handle that.
Okay.
I can always use some more money. But here's the thing that I...
we also confiscate all their assets in the city.
Oh, I can... I'm assuming I get a good 10%, 20% VIG off of that.
The other thing, speaking of VIGs, that I'm big into is starting a waste, fraud, and corruption lottery.
Okay. How does this work?
Well, in all the cities that I've been in Philadelphia, in Fort Myers, Florida, in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, here in Los Angeles especially, there's always waste, fraud, and corruption.
Which has the most?
Oh, Los Angeles is the biggest city I've been in, so probably it has the most in terms of just, huge amounts of money in payouts to citizens who were hit by cop cars that were speeding when they shouldn't have been.
Right.
Or you find out somebody at the housing authority has been on the take and taking tens of thousands of dollars. Or people are getting their tickets fixed. Any number of things that involve waste, fraud, and corruption. You expect a certain amount of this in a city. We can't eliminate all of it. This is waste, fraud, and corruption that is a waste of our taxes, right? This is our money.
Right.
So, what I propose is simply a lottery. We set aside $2 million, let's say, maybe $5 million. And then all taxpayers get their name in the hat, and maybe you pick out 10 people every year or 100 people every year who get 10 grand. Or maybe 20 grand, tax-free. Do what they want with it. You can only get this once. You would feel a lot better about all the waste, fraud, and corruption. This would be an acknowledgement that, okay, citizen, there's going to be waste, fraud, and corruption, but you at least have a chance to have your head in the trough.
Right.
You have a chance, and I think people would feel a lot better about it. They'd
It's out in the open.
It's a nod.
Yeah.
We understand that you're frustrated, and we're going to give you a little back just for putting up with all the crap that we put you through and wasting your taxpayer dollars. This would be a drop in the bucket, and it would make everybody happy. It's like your boss bringing in pizza once a month.
It's not so much that there's all that crap happening on these city levels, but that it just we pretend it doesn't, and then it comes out, and then there's that burst of angst about it. And
you want the money?
Yeah, we want the money.
Give me the $1 million.
Sure.
I would have spent it on something useful instead of having it being frittered away in fake overtime or whatever the thing was, or fake disability suits, whatever it was.
Sure. It's more
Give
dignified.
me a chance.
It's more dignified. I would love to know what the lottery winners do with the money, though. I'd like that to be a condition that the press can and will cover the use of the money.
No. You get to use it however you want.
Well, you get to, but it's fascinating to see.
Yeah, but if you were held publicly accountable for it,
oh well, there is
then
that.
you'd be pressured into giving it to charity or something.
Now, part of my mind stayed on driving for a second and processed this idea. Do you have those times? And I can drive. I've sometimes driven a car here. Do you have those times when it's just like the middle of the night, or it's late, or somehow there's not a lot of traffic, and you're cruising down the street. You're really going 20 minutes to everywhere, and you see the ghost of the driver's paradise the city might have been in the early 1960s.
Oh, like on Carmageddon.
I guess, yeah, like the reverse Carmageddon that Carmageddon was.
Yep, that's wonderful. Well, holidays are like that. Martin Luther King Day, for instance, you can drive pretty much anywhere because there's maybe there's 10 or 20% fewer people on the roads. It doesn't take much just to reduce it from being, too crowded to being just enough. You don't need to get everybody off the roads. You don't have to have it get down to 50% or 25%. Just reducing 10 or 20% off the roads makes a huge amount of difference. So absolutely. When my cousin came to town from Kentucky, I think it was over the 4th of July weekend, we drove to the Getty Villa in 20 minutes from downtown Los Angeles.
20 minutes to everywhere.
Yeah,
as it was intended to be for a very brief window, as I understand it. I mean, it does seem like
because all the highways were built, right, and they weren't all there in the 30s,
right,
40s, but then, the newspaper. I've talked to newspaper photographers who'd hang out downtown. They'd get their assignment over a payphone,
right,
and go off and cover it, and they'd be there in 20 minutes.
Wow. So there's that. I love the idea. Love is too strong, but it's fascinating to me that there's this sort of this ghost of a city designed a little differently than cities can be designed today, underneath or inside Los Angeles, that only comes out in certain conditions, and then you can experience it, but only then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent time to get out and explore the city.
Right, true.
That'd be a good day for you to rent a car.
That's very true indeed. Now, you do off-ramp, you get all over the place, you get stories from everywhere, you see everything, and you mentioned, visiting relatives who come in from Kentucky, showing people around. You've no doubt had this task many times. What can you tell people who are showing outsiders Los Angeles, from the lessons you've learned from off-ramp and from reporting here? What's important to know when you're getting an outsider in here, when you're showing them what's what, when you have limited time, when you want to give people the in to the city?
I'll say get high.
Get high.
Take them to the observatory. Take them to the city hall, and climb up there and bring a map and figure out where everything is. Show them where it is, then they can grasp it because likely they don't know what's going on. I would also say go to 2 or 3 places, because otherwise it's just going to be insane if you try to drive all over the place. You're just going to wind up angry and having a fight.
You're going to wind up 43 and angry.
Yeah.
Tell me about this part of Off-Ramp that we didn't talk about last time. You know, we discussed so much the pointillist portrait nature of the city that Off-Ramp is. Tell me about how radio documentaries are woven into this mix as well, because you see documentaries on subjects like Ernest Shackleton or Orson Welles come up. How does that fit into the whole Off-Ramp picture?
I don't think that there's necessarily a grand plan.
Sure.
When the time comes, if somebody proposes an idea that's worth spending a whole hour on, or actually, 48 and a half minutes on, then we might greenlight a documentary. I did a documentary about Ernest Shackleton back in the 90s for National Public Radio that I've used on holidays. Because it's a wonderful story. It has absolutely nothing to do with Southern California, but it's a great story about, leadership and deprivation and history. It also has a wonderful ending because nobody died. So my Ernest Shackleton documentary, Walking Out of History, is just a natural to run. Also, it was produced at exactly the length for Off-Ramp. So that makes it very, very, very helpful.
Beautiful coincidence.
Yeah. The first documentary we produced for the show was called The Ashes of Oak Ridge, after the Oak Ridge Mobile Home Park that was destroyed in a huge fire a number of years ago. My producer at the time, Queena Kim, and Frank Stoltz did a lot of reporting on the fire, and they came to me and said, "Look, there's all this material. We could really go in depth and show how this fire affected the people of Oak Ridge. Can we do this documentary?" And I talked with the bosses, and we got Frank off the daily beat for a while, and Queena and Frank, and also with help from Jackson Musker, they produced a wonderful moving documentary that walked you through the fire, talked about how it affected people's lives. We also, for instance, talked with Frank's mom, who she and her husband, Frank's dad, lost a home to a fire. And this was his home that he built. It was the house that he wanted to live in forever, destroyed. And she and the mom, Mary, says that her husband was a changed man till the day he died. It broke his spirit. And that's the kind of stuff you don't think about. What happens when you lose everything. All you generally see are people the day after saying, "Well, we're just glad that we're all out alive and safe. That's all that matters." Well, it goes a lot deeper than that. So we did that documentary, The Ashes of Oak Ridge, available online. It's wonderful. We also ran 2 documentaries from R.H. Green, the filmmaker, and he did one about Vampira, who was the wonderful, very short-term celebrity in Los Angeles who did one of those horror movie shows on local TV.
Beloved of a generation, no doubt.
I don't know that she's beloved. She's because she didn't do there aren't shows that are. I think she's kind of faded from memory. People remember it probably. Right. Some people remember it anyway. Then there's barely any footage of this show. It doesn't exist anymore except in people's minds. But he did a wonderful documentary because he knew Mila Nurmi, that was her name, in her later years, and interviewed her extensively and found out many wonderful details of her life. That's available online in the Off-Ramp archives, as well as R.H. Green's documentary about Orson Welles, which I know that you're a big fan of. And he focused not on Citizen Kane, not on the marriage to Rita Hayworth or anything like that. Instead, he focused on his radio works and on his extensive radio history, and not just the War of the Worlds, but the decades of work in radio that Orson Welles did all through the time that he was making films and starring in films, and presenting a totally different picture, a totally different kind of career arc than most people know about Orson Welles. That was called Airborne, and we aired it I believe in October. You can find it in the Off-Ramp archives at kpcc.org.
Even just as a listener to radio documentaries or pieces on radio where someone's on the spot recording an interview, what do you find most fascinating about that form, the visual-less, often heard in the car form that these take on? Documentaries
absolutely have to sustain. I think too many people think you can make an hour documentary about anything, when in fact you can't, and people will get bored on most topics that you'd spend an hour on, or you have to do a lot more work for the documentary than a lot of people think you would in order to make it sustain for a whole hour. I don't know exactly what to say about this.
You can just say you don't know and don't think about it.
Mostly I say no to people who want to do documentaries.
Okay.
Because they simply don't sustain. The idea doesn't sustain for a whole hour, at least not for Off-Ramp. Right. The Orson Welles documentary had so many audio clips in it, so much stuff we had never heard before, presented several different arcs of character development, of personality, of it kind of showed the history of broadcasting. There were so many different things happening in it, and yet it was still very focused. That made it a perfect documentary for Off-Ramp, and the connection with Southern California. This is the entertainment capital of the world.
Sure.
Radio is huge here in Los Angeles. Simple enough, and RH had all of this, wonderful tape. So it was a natural for Off-Ramp.
Now, you're on a parking meter. We'll put a cap on this, but let me say, last time on our last conversation, you mentioned how cool it was, how fascinating it is, how fun it is to get out from the studio into the streets recording this new show. I found that's certainly true. I've no doubt been influenced by my Off-Ramp listening in a lot of ways, and I'm sure other people who want to do radio are getting influenced even now by Off-Ramp. What do you say to those people who are listening to Off-Ramp saying, I should really get inspired by this, I should make something like this? What would you tell them?
Tell them, go buy a cheap iPhone and record stuff and make podcasts. There's a kid who's interning with us now. I think he's 20. He's producing full-fledged news stories that are pretty good on his website, on his blog.
And he has 23 years before he's going to get angry.
And yes, he does. And if you go out and interview, if you're mildly interested in getting out and doing a show, if you go out and interview people, you're going to find out so much more about the community that you live in, about the city that you live in. You'll feel enriched just by going through the exercise of asking people more about it, of putting together a story about it. I highly recommend it. It's not going to, maybe nobody will listen to it, but you'll at least have done this extra work to explore where you live.
I've been speaking with John Rabe of KPCC's Off-Ramp. You can hear that on weekends or at kpcc.org in the podcast version. John, always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to the people backing in this season, including Aidan Millman, Andy Cooney, Ben Bartley, Brian J. Dell, Doubt Us Artwork, Greg Bigelow, Greg Linster, Henry Coronan, Umberto Grant, James Faber, Jonathan McCalmont, Mark Larson, Matt Warren, Mia Muratori, Nicholas Croft, Paul Doyle, Ray McGuire, Rob Montz, Robert Foley, Roberto Medri, Samuel Hansen, Sean Dudley, Small Demons, Stephen Ingles, Steve Himmer, TSD, and Wayne Wright.